organization, Theirworld. And so I will be the moderator of today's conversation. I'll be taking us through this presentation itself. And Itamar will begin with the slide presentations in the background as well as we start to get things moving this morning. So with that, just a few notes that I'd like to have in terms of the webinar and how we'll be going about the presentation today. So we are recording this webinar, so just so everybody's aware that we are going to be recording this, so we'll be able to share it afterwards for all of you. And if we could have the slide up with some of the just ground rules, just to remind people of what will be happening during the webinar itself. All of the attendees, if you're wondering why you can't see each other or why you can't speak, it's because you are on mute at the moment. That's okay. We've sort of muted everybody that's joining except for the panelists. If you have a question, at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box, so you can use that. And throughout the presentation, please log your questions. I'll be checking those, and we'll come to those towards the end of today's presentation, and we'll have a bit of Q&A, and we can even try to get technologically advanced and let some people speak if we're feeling dangerous and we want to live on the edge. But yes, during the conversation itself, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen for any questions. If you have any technical issues or any other comments around what's happening, please use the webinar chat box at the bottom. Our colleague Rob, who's our Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Programs, he will be on that channel answering any questions that you might have, particularly around logistics or technicalities. But any questions you'd like us to answer during this conversation, please put them into the Q&A box. And if you really, really want to be multitasking, you can also talk to us online at Theirworld on Twitter. So I guess one of the most important things is, before we get started, is who is Theirworld? And so I'd like to just give a brief introduction to those of you who may not be familiar with our organization. And so Theirworld, we are a global children's charity, and we're committed to ending what we call the global education crisis. And that is the fact that over 250 million young people around the world do not have access to school. If we look just 10 years from now in 2030, we know there'll be 1.6 billion young people of school age, and less than half will be on track to have the most basic skills they'll need to be able to enter the workforce and successfully participate in society. And so that's the challenge that we as an organization are really focused on. And our mission is to ensure that every single child has the best start in life, a safe place to learn, and the skills that they need for the future. And so we run programs on the ground in different countries throughout the world. We also do campaigning and advocacy, and we do all of this to make what seems impossible more probable. And I think the situation in Greece that we're going to talk about today is one of those issues that we picked up, and we thought that not enough attention was being placed on this issue. And that's why we've been doing what we're doing in Greece, and why we're so excited that you've all joined us today to learn a bit more about this. And what we say we try to do every day is unlock big change. And that's really what we're hoping we can do with this, this issue in particular. And so that's just the backdrop to our organization and who we are. Throughout the slide presentation, throughout this conversation today, one of the features we also have is a polling box. And so at different times throughout the presentation, while we're having a conversation, we'll be polling the audience on a different issue, and then we'll be reporting back what you think. And the first question that we have, and this is before I introduce our presenter for today, is in Greece, there's a camp called the Moria camp that's housing refugees in one of the Greek islands. And it was originally designed for 2,500 individuals. And so we'll put the question up on the screen, and you'll be able to answer it. How many people reside in this camp? And you could select from 2,500, which is the maximum capacity, 5,000, or 20,000. So how many people do you think reside in the camp that was designed for 2,500 people? So you can answer that question right now, and we'll come back to that shortly. And it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and our main presenter for today, Mesa Jalbet. If we can go to the slide with Mesa's bio there. So Mesa is a great friend of Theirworld, and she's also the author of the report that we're going to speak about today. Mesa is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and she's a special advisor at Arizona State University and at Massachusetts Institute of Technology on open learning and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Mesa, we're so happy to have you here with us today. Thanks so much for joining us from Dubai.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for taking the initiative to uncover this issue and put it in the spotlight. It's much needed.
Great. No, we really appreciate it. You've been doing a lot of the thinking behind this. You've been out to the refugee camps in Greece. You've been speaking with the government, with the different UN agencies, with the different nonprofit organizations. So you have a really great view of what the situation is and what some of the challenges are that we face and what we need to do to make sure that every young person has an education. So we're looking forward to that. The first question that I put out was just a question about the Maria camp. And Itamar, could we see what the results are of the poll? We asked how many people we think live in the camp, and many people here, a third of the people got it right. Oh no, 61% of the people got it right. Currently, the camp, designed for 2,500 people, is housing about 20,000 refugees. And so that's just one statistic. And Mason, maybe you could just kick it off by explain to everyone, why are we talking about Greece? What is the situation in the Greek islands? Where are these refugees coming from? And if you could give us a bit of the context around this.
Right, it's a really important question because, as you know, the world is full of challenges, and there are multiple hotspots where there is a much greater number of refugees. So I do face this question very often. Why would we want to focus on Greece? Well, unfortunately, the situation in Greece has reached a completely untenable humanitarian situation. It's been so challenging over the last couple of years in particular. I'd like to just maybe start with giving a little bit of background, because I'm sure a lot of people on the webinar, and thank you to everyone who's joined, have some information. But for those of you who don't, this has been brewing since 2015. At the time when we started seeing an influx of largely Syrian refugees heading to Europe. But in the last 2 years, it's really reached a boiling point. In particular because the European Union closed its borders and made an arrangement with Turkey and Greece to essentially lock up the border so that refugees are not able to continue to the western part of Europe. So essentially they come through to the islands, the Greek islands, as their entry point, hoping to continue on to Europe, but end up being stuck in Greece. So right now we have over 118,000 refugees across Greece, with about 42,000 of them on the Greek islands. And those are the ones that are suffering the most. Those are the ones that, just as you mentioned, Moria camp, where you have such a huge concentration of people. The camps were designed for much less, but also they were very importantly designed to be very temporary shelters as the United Nations and the government process their applications to accept them as asylum seekers and to move them onto the mainland, or in fact move them to the rest of Europe. But what's happened over the last couple of years is that they have now stayed on the islands in situations that are no human should be living in. Justin, you mentioned that we've worked on many projects together, most of them for refugee contexts. I've been to many refugee camps. This was by far one of the worst I've ever seen. I met families and young men that have come from extremely difficult situations. They're from Gaza, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and all of them told me that despite the horrendous situation that they had left behind in their home countries, or where they've become refugees, and the fact that they risked their lives to get there, the worst thing about them being refugees at the moment is having to survive the horrendous living conditions that they're currently in and not knowing what their future holds.
And I think that's probably something that's difficult when you first hear it to understand, because when people think about refugee context, you know, there are many places around the world that someone can find themselves as a refugee, and many people go on vacation to the Greek islands, and so they don't think of it as a place that sounds so terrible. Could you just give some insight into what the conditions are like in the camps?
So obviously there's huge overcrowding. You've got situations where families who don't know each other, come from completely different cultures, who've had to share tents. You've got a situation where the camp has become so overcrowded that the United Nations is not able to actually provide proper support. So they have now started with the Greek authorities to tell new coming refugees to just pitch a tent anywhere where they can find an empty spot. So the camps are spilling onto nearby sites, you know, olive groves, and in conditions where it is not fit for families, and in particular for children. There are too many children who are at extreme risk, and in particular, you know, there is a crisis within the crisis in that there are over 5,000 children who are unaccompanied, who have arrived there having lost their parents along the way or having fled extremely difficult conditions, and have arrived to the island only to find themselves in a situation where they have no protection, they don't have proper living condition support, they have no access to proper healthcare or education, and they're exposed to, you know, everything from sexual exploitation to trafficking. It is perhaps one of the most glaring humanitarian shortcomings of our time. And in fact, the Greek government and the Prime Minister has recognized this and has developed, put together a commission to try to address the situation, and has been pleading with European countries to help, in particular with the unaccompanied minors. Unfortunately, these are accompanied minors that are largely between the age of 14 and 18, but there are some as young as 7. I met some of those children. I can't tell you how difficult it is to see them there, wandering around alone with no support. And all of the organizations that are involved, you know, feel the pain of this and want to be able to do more, but their hands are extremely tied until there is a solution found for these children, until they're settled in safe communities and that they're able to start supporting them fully. And of course, the best solution, the solution that is required, is to support them into moving on and reunifying with family members. But we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Great. No, thanks for that. And you know, we're going to transition the conversation to speak about young people when they're in this situation and what their future looks like. What opportunities do they have? And we're going to focus on education. And so if we could pull up the next poll question that we thought we would ask the audience joining us today is, if you're a refugee, how long is the average child refugee displaced, or a young person displaced or a refugee? Do you think that the average child is displaced as a refugee for 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, or more than 15 years? So again, if you're a child anywhere in the world as a refugee, what's your average time of displacement? 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, or more than 15 years? So quite a span there. And I think this is a really good segue, Mesa, into why we're focusing on education with this report, and why we're focusing on opportunities that's provided to young people. It's more of enough people have replied to the survey. I'm curious what the survey results or the poll is saying. Do we know how people are voting? All right, so about 38% of the people are saying more than 15 years. Half of you believe that it's 8 years, and then we have about 10% thinking it's 5 years or less. Unfortunately, the average refugee, child is a refugee for about 17 plus years. So the correct answer would have been more than 15 years. And so I think the important part is that if you become a refugee at the age of 3 or 4, it could be your entire school age period of your life that you remain a refugee. And so that's why some of these essential services like education are important, because you could remain a refugee and at the end of that period, if there's no education, have no access to the opportunity to learn or any basic skills. And so Mesa, could you start to sort of give us insight into what the situation is like for these children in terms of access to education?
So one of the things that is important to know about the refugee crisis in Greece is that 60% of the population is under the age of 30. And there's approximately about 31,000 school-aged children. Unfortunately, to date, just under a third, or about a third, have actually made it into formal schooling. The rest of the children, whether they're on the mainland or the island, are not in any form of schooling. The focus of this report is in particular on the Greek islands, and the reason being is that the children there have had very little access to education. Thanks to the United Nations, UNHCR, and UNICEF and their partner NGOs, local Greek NGOs, they've been able to reach just about 1,500 young people, and that's really been no small feat. They mobilized very quickly, and they were able to get resources from Theirworld. That we should say that Theirworld is actually the biggest funder of refugee education on the islands, and it's doing that in partnership with the UN agencies and a number of excellent NGOs, which are all listed in the report, and I'd like to give them a shout out. They're doing a really fantastic job. But like I said, the vast majority of children and youth are not in any form of schooling. The education that's available to them is what we call non-formal education. So it is, they don't go to a government school, but rather they are participating in a number of programs that help them gain language skills. So they learn Greek and they learn some basic numeracy and literacy. But very importantly, those programs work with these children to give them a safe environment, to provide them with an opportunity to begin to heal from the trauma that they're facing, and an outlet away from the refugee camp, which is so challenging for a child to be in because it's such a toxic environment. So this education that is provided to them is so important, but unfortunately the UN agencies and the NGOs don't have enough resources to reach all the children that need help. And, thus is the challenge that we are discussing today. And it was already very challenging prior to the current conditions that we're living in, prior to the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. But unfortunately, the pandemic now has made it virtually impossible for any child to have access to education because, as you might imagine, the camps are not well equipped with technology. They're also now largely enclosed in that, in trying to make sure that the virus doesn't spread to the camp. There's very limited movement in and out. So the UN agencies and the NGOs are trying to do what they can to reach young people, but by and large, there's virtually no education happening now. So it's quite the dire situation.
No, that's great. And I see that some people are using the chat box, and I encourage people, if they have questions that they'd like Mesa to answer as we move forward, to put that in the Q&A. One of the questions that came through, Mesa, is you sort of mentioned the 1,200 to 1,400 students that are learning through the existing programs, but that's at a single time because children also move quickly at points. And somebody's pointing out that the report, we talk about the 5,000 children that have benefited from the support that Theirworld put in with Education Cannot Wait. Could you talk a bit about that just for a moment to clarify sort of how that works with the numbers?
Yeah, thanks for whoever asked the question. It's very important because I don't want to undermine in any way the important work that is being done. And in fact, the NGOs and the UN are trying to do their best to reach young people. But this is very much a moving situation in that it's very difficult to, because of lack of resources and because they're largely not able to reach the children inside the refugee camp. They have to move them out to surrounding areas to provide the non-formal education environment. And so it's not possible to provide education to everybody at the same time. So in fact, it works in shifts. That's one of the challenges. The other challenge is that, of course, everybody wants these children to be relocated to the mainland and to be settled and to find a home and start a new life. So it's often they're working, and this is not unique to Greece, but the case in many refugee settings, the families will tend to move and not necessarily continue the program. But the important thing here is to recognize that they're trying to reach as many as they can with limited resources. And yes, in fact, there's been just over 5,000 beneficiaries to date. What we want to do is to really increase that number, and this is what we'll talk about a little further down the line.
Great, thank you, Mesa. And you were speaking a bit about the challenges, and maybe what would be helpful is to talk about different groups of individuals or institutions that are part of this crisis and part of the solution. And maybe if you could describe the challenges that each of those groups face. And maybe we could start with just the children themselves, sort of refugee children. What are the barriers that they face when it comes to education?
Right, it's really important to dissect it a little bit because obviously refugee populations are not homogeneous, and when we talk about children, we've got the full spectrum from 0 to 18, and then of course youth up to the age of 30. So their challenges are slightly different, and their needs are also different. And in our attempt to really explain the situation, we've broken it down into different groups. Now, children and unaccompanied minors, obviously, as we just spoke, have very little access to education. And for those who are on the mainland, it's much higher. They have very low enrollment rates outside of primary education as well. This is also not unique to Greece, but it is pronounced here in that the support so far has been focused on primary education. But with the refugee population being, as I just mentioned, for example, when the unaccompanied minors are largely between the ages of 14 and 18, it's really important to point out that there's very little access to education for those who are outside of primary level education. And, an added challenge is the fact that many of these children and families have been on the move for quite some time. So, if they're coming, whether it's from the Congo or Afghanistan or Syria, they probably were somewhere else in between or multiple places. So they've been out of school for quite some time. Therefore, their skill sets are lower than expected for their age group. In addition to them not having access or not having learned prior the Greek language. So it makes it there are multiple challenges in integrating them into public education. Last but not least, on this age group for children and unaccompanied minors, one of the huge benefits of education is that it is a safe environment, and that for refugee settings, usually psychosocial support is provided in a way to ensure that the child starts to heal, but also is able to learn, is in a condition to learn. And at the moment, on the Greek islands, there's very little access to psychosocial support, which is something that needs to be remedied very, very soon. We've heard that from families, we've heard that from the NGOs themselves, everyone who's interacting with the refugees directly. This is a deeply traumatized population, and they need help.
So on one side, you have the refugees, but also you have the host communities. So you have the communities and the schools that exist in those communities. And I know you mentioned that most of those formal schools aren't receiving refugees, but could you maybe just talk about what some of those barriers are on the flip side for the communities and the local school systems?
Right. So, you know, we cannot talk about the refugee crisis in Greece without um, admitting that it has been a huge burden on you know, Greece and the Greek population, and in particular in the context of education, on schools and the communities hosting them. So in that challenge, in actually receiving these children, uh, there has been a little bit of friction with local communities who have been wary about the presence of refugees in their schools. And there have been some reasons for that. You know, one example would be fear around the children not necessarily having the right level of vaccinations before they enter schools. And there has been, that has been slow to happen, and has been a real concern. Also, there's, on the islands in particular, there's not a lot of space. These schools are built for very small populations. So it's not easy to absorb the refugees onto the camps. Also, most importantly, teachers have not necessarily been prepared to teach a diverse group of children in their classrooms, let alone refugee children who have very different learning needs and have very different skill sets. And language is an extreme barrier. So often the child, even if they're present in the classroom, the teacher's not able to engage with them. And you know, another challenge is that there has been little work around helping families and children integrate into communities, although that's starting to change. In that, you know, the government is starting to provide some support to schools and to parents to understand the situation. But we're still a long way from getting there, and definitely a lot more work is needed to alleviate the pressure that communities and schools face, but also to help refugees integrate in a healthy way.
Great, thanks. And I mean, I guess part of this also, you mentioned if they're not in formal schools, you have a lot of the non-formal education providers, some of the NGOs, and some of them are on this webinar today. Could you maybe summarize what the barriers are for those organizations that are trying to step in and fulfill that role that's not being filled at the moment?
Right. I have to say that the NGOs I met and the ones working with UNHCR and UNICEF are, you know, just remarkable. They're working with very little resources. They mobilized as quickly as they could. Some of them have been recognized, you know, globally for their amazing work. Many of them are running with the support of refugees and a lot of, you know, young, eager volunteers and employees. But you know, they require a lot of support, and not just financial, but also support in the form of resources and training and just generally much more flexibility in being able to work with the refugee community. They're quite constrained at the moment. You know, one of the challenges that they face once the children are with them is what we talked about just a minute ago, which is that those children have very poor learning levels prior to even entering the program. So they really have to work with them at a very basic level. And I saw that with my own eyes. You know, I met a Syrian girl who was 13 but never been in school yet because, as you mentioned, Justin, the Syrian war has existed for the length of her school age life to date, and so she's been out of school. And there are many children who are like that. Another challenge would be that they're really, you know, they're really under-resourced. And despite doing their best, there's much support that they need to be resourced. And this is unique to the situation in Greece. In fact, I think as a global refugee education community, we need to do much better in supporting non-governmental organizations that are working on the ground directly with refugees. And the third and really important challenge is that there has been no coordination with the government to ensure that the curriculum that they're providing, the non-formal education that they're providing, is aligned with the public education system, so that the transition for the child is seamless. And this is something that I heard time and again. You know, the concern that will they be ready once the time comes to make that leap into the public education system.
Great, thanks. And just a reminder for those of you listening in, we're going to do Q&A here shortly. And if you do have questions, please put those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and not necessarily the chat box that we're using just for technical issues. So again, please use the Q&A box, because that's what I'll be using when we do the questions here shortly. Mesa, that's really interesting. And I guess the last question I have, and I think there may actually be some individuals from the Greek government on the webinar today, is what's the role of the government? Some people would say, because refugees are arriving in Greece, the Greek Ministry of Education should be providing education to those children. And I know it's not that easy, and I know there are some challenges that the government must face as well. Could you maybe give us some insight into what those challenges are for the Ministry of Education in Greece?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that Greece has not received the recognition that it deserves for having really been blindsided by this refugee crisis. Greece is a very hospitable country. It has had a history of hosting refugees. This is a crisis that they didn't ask for. And yet they are dealing with it in a way that, and in particular the Ministry of Education, they're dealing with it in a way that is extremely challenging. One of the challenges is that the Ministry of Education is obviously tied to the rest of government, and therefore is not able necessarily to move as quickly as it needs to in supporting children, integrating them into public education, because they have to work with the whole of government on the plan. So they have to work with you know, the government in terms of being able to relocate young people to where they can go to school. They have to work with, in the whole new structure around reunification. They have to work with health. They have to work with security. So it is more complicated than meets the eye, and requires a whole of government approach. And we often forget that ministries of education, you know, are just one slice of the solution, and they need the support of the full government. The other challenge is that this has been in crisis mode for quite some time, and so unfortunately, there has not been a time where they've been able to step back and actually create a comprehensive national plan, which is absolutely needed. And what we see happen in almost every context where there's a refugee crisis is the international community then comes in and supports the national government in creating one national plan, because of the recognition that the burden falls on them first and foremost. And so there is no national plan here. There's no comprehensive plan, as I mentioned. And this makes it extremely difficult to plan and to move in unison between all the different partners. The third challenge is the fact that you know, it has caused a strain on the ministry itself and its own goals. So we have to recognize that Greece, like many other countries, are looking to improve their education uh, system, to improve the outcome of their education system. And they themselves are going through a progressive path to get there. And the integration of refugee children into the schools has an impact on them. And it requires them to have additional resources, more support in order to be able to do that, while at the same time maintaining the goals that they have. And I would say, last but not least, there's no one education response that fits all. And as we mentioned, these children, some of them have been out of school for a long time. Some are, as a result, a much older age group than the normal setting of a classroom, and therefore require specialized solutions for each age group, which obviously is much more challenging than simply opening schools up and allowing children in. Again, come back to this issue of unaccompanied minors and how challenging it is, and the need for support from the EU and the international community in particular for this group.
Great. And so just to give everyone a sense of where we're headed with this conversation, we've talked a lot about the challenges, and we're going to now start to pivot towards what some of the solutions are. And then we also have two special guests that we've invited in who make a few remarks, and I'll ask them a question to respond to, that are working sort of on the ground in Greece, and then another colleague who's working on sort of the broader response. And then we'll go to the Q&A. But I think one thing that's on everyone's mind, Mesa, is we're going to go into our proposed response, but COVID-19, as you mentioned, is something that's a global challenge that's cutting across every single issue, from healthcare to employment to the economy to education systems. Today 1.5 billion young people across the planet are no longer in formal school structures because of the pandemic. Could you just shed a bit more light on sort of what's currently happening in the camps for these children when it comes to education, given COVID-19, and sort of what the immediate response is on that front?
Just unfortunately, the children in those camps on the islands are not having any access to non-formal education in the way that they did prior to the start of the pandemic. What the UN agencies and the NGOs that are working with them are trying to do, and they're trying to do their best under this current circumstances, deliver packets for language and other skills to the camps that get distributed by the organizations inside the camp. Some of them are also reaching them via telephone, to continue to provide support and encouragement to continue. But unfortunately, it's very limited because the infrastructure has not been set up for that, and because there is, of course, limited movement as a result of the lockdown. And they've been in a fortunate situation to a certain extent, is that the last I heard, there were no cases of coronavirus among the refugees on the islands, and so they want to maintain it that way, and I don't blame them, because given the horrendous living conditions, if the virus took hold there, it would be a huge humanitarian disaster. And so unfortunately, this has moved from being a health crisis to a double education crisis in the case of these children, in that they are unable to access the non-formal education. And with that, just as we've been talking, that means they have very limited support, no access to any sort of a relief. And we probably don't mention it enough, the impact on their mental health and their inability to see sort of any movement towards a better future is extremely crushing. So the United Nations, both UNHCR and UNICEF, have been calling on the international community to provide them with an emergency fund to support them to be able to reach children while this pandemic is going on, and perhaps they can talk about that a bit more. But certainly it has been just an incredible challenge on top of an existing terrible situation.
Great. So now let's get on to the solution, because at Theirworld and sort of with this report, we do think that there's hope. We do think that something that's not incredibly complicated could be done relatively quickly to ensure that more than 10,000 young people have opportunity to education while they're in this situation. And so Mesa, there's a 3-point plan that you put together when talking to the ministry, when talking to the UN agencies and the various organizations. Could you walk us through what that 3-point plan is and what would need to happen for us to change the reality for these children in the refugee camps?
Very happily. I guess it's really important to say that I'm very optimistic. I think that this situation is resolvable. There's a solution. Actually, there are multiple solutions. And so while we should be concerned that the situation is dire as is, there are very clear solutions. They're detailed in the report to a certain extent. But what is needed is additional financial resources. So in our 3-point plan, the first point is to provide urgent financial assistance to ensure that the UN agencies and their NGO partners are able to continue what they've started, to continue to reach the thousands of children that they are already supporting, but to also double that and to take into account the continuous increase, about 30% continuous increase. So we're asking the international community, the EU, philanthropists to help join this campaign and to provide 20 million euros, which, to be frank, I've worked all over the world. I've worked with the refugee context. This is not a huge amount. This is a very doable amount for very concrete solutions, for very direct impact. So that's point number one. And I should mention that there is the possibility with this funding to really increase the amount of children that we're able to reach in the early childhood years. And this is so critical and so important and often forgotten in the context of refugees. UNICEF and their partner organizations are actually providing some support to young children and to mothers with young children. And it's so incredibly valued. I visited that center and found that the mothers were so welcoming of this relief and this support and needed it so badly. And yet there are thousands of mothers and thousands of children under the age of 5 who have no access. So with this 20 million relief, we'd be able to reach at least 6,000 more early childhood learners and another 6,000 mothers with infants. And this cannot be, the importance of this cannot be underestimated, and is needed not only so that they have some level of relief, but it's really important so that they can begin to learn as early as possible, so they can begin to heal, they can begin to prepare for schooling. And based on research, we know that the younger the child, and the more support that they receive, the more likeliness that they're able to enter primary school and succeed in it successfully. And so we can't forget about this group. And I'm so happy that Theirworld is such a strong advocate of early childhood education. And I hope for anyone who's listening that this issue gets more attention. And we move on to point number 2. Perhaps we can come back to point number 1 and elaborate a little bit more on it. But just so we can get to the questions, because that's the part that's most important in a webinar. Point number 2 is to ensure that there is international support for a comprehensive refugee education plan across Greece. And at the pinnacle of that is to ensure that there is support for the Greek government. As I mentioned earlier, Greece needs a national comprehensive education plan that encompasses all refugee children. And for that to happen, the Greek government needs to be at the center of the solution. They need to be the ones who develop the plan in conjunction with their partners on the ground, with the UN agencies and the NGOs, with the donors, and with other government departments. You know, they have done, what they've done so far is, like we mentioned earlier, is there's about 13,000 children who are in public schools, but the total number is over 30,000 children who still need access. And so to reach there, to get there, an ad hoc approach is not going to work, and working alone is not going to work. So they do need support. And also related to that is the critical importance of the support of the European Union to Greece in finding a fair and sustainable solution for the unaccompanied minors. Now, point number 3 is that while we need to support Greece and we need to provide emergency support for non-formal education on the Greek islands, we cannot forget that this is not an isolated challenge. This refugee educational crisis in Greece is part of a much bigger challenge. And we know that one of the factors that increases the number of refugees, increases the number of children who are out of school, is the fact that children coming from other settings have not had access to quality education. There are a big number of the refugees in Greece are Syrian. There are 60 nationalities, but a huge number are Syrian. And so these Syrian refugees are coming from other countries. They're coming from Turkey, from Jordan, from Lebanon, from within Syria itself. And one of the big reasons when you talk to families about why they've taken that journey and moved from one refugee context to the other is that they have not had access to education and a pathway to a sustainable livelihood. So they do take this step, they endanger their lives to on to Greece and in Europe in order to secure a better future. So it is essential for the international community to make good on their promise to fund the refugee education crisis in the countries with the biggest, who are the biggest hosts, which are, in the case of Syrian refugees, it's Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Those countries are extremely underfunded, and while they've done their best to integrate children into their schools, they still need far more support to be able to carry on and to increase access to very vulnerable populations, particularly youth. So we could not really address the situation fully without making sure that we look at the issue beyond the borders of Greece, and that we really implore the funders to consider the fact that they need to support Greece and surrounding areas. And I want to say also here that it's been particularly challenging for the UN agencies and for Greece to get support for the refugee crisis, and in particular for the education crisis. And that is because, it's falling through the cracks of the large education infrastructure that's out there. There is no one place for the UN agencies to go and get funding for this crisis, and that's just not acceptable. I hope that today we can discuss that in a bit more detail, and I hope that this campaign that Theirworld has mounted will shed light on the fact that there's this massive gap in the system. And I would just say, if there's any philanthropists on the line, this is your time. This is your time to come in and support the UN agencies in making sure that they reach thousands of children. The system has failed these children, and philanthropists are the ones who can come in and fill that gap and show leadership, and the others will follow. And for relatively small investments, there could be a massive impact.
Thanks, Mesa. I think one of the questions that I've noted that a few people have actually asked this in the Q&A box is around where. So the initial response, you say we need to mobilize about $20 million. When I say mobilize, I want to make it clear we're not fundraising for our organization. We're talking about fundraising for others to do the work and mobilizing support for them. Could you just highlight where would the money go? Who does it need to go to? And some of the questions actually that are coming up are around sort of is there an estimated breakdown between organizations? We have some organizations, I know Jacob Warren here is one of the larger non-formal education providers in the island. We also had a similar question from Katarina, and I know that we can go back to them with more details, obviously, but if you could just highlight sort of generally where the money would go, how would it be distributed, that would be really helpful, I think, for people.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important point, and it's hugely important to point out that Theirworld, and I'm certainly not, as the author of the report, advocating to fundraise for Theirworld, but actually to mobilize resources in support of all the organizations that are working on the ground. We'd be, very happy to see donors support these organizations directly as a result of this call. Even when we're calling for funding UN agencies then in turn turn around and work with NGOs to deliver these non-formal education programs all across. So the 20 million euros we've estimated would be, as I mentioned earlier, to support the existing programs to continue, to double the number of children who benefit, and to account for an increase both at the primary level, the early childhood, and also secondary and beyond. Now, I encourage you to look at the details in the report. We provide some breakdowns there. I don't think we need to go into them here, but to mention that what's really needed is to be able to mobilize these funds very, very quickly. These organizations know what they need to do. They have high ambitions to be able to deliver as quickly as possible. But the longer we wait to provide them with this funding, the less likely it is that they'll be able to restart their programs come the fall. So there is an urgency around being able to secure this funding as soon as possible so they can start planning and ramping up. It's not a normal situation. So it's not like there are a plethora of school settings where they can just fill them with children. In many cases on these islands, they need to build makeshift buildings. They need to be able to recruit teachers from off island, and they need to be able to, bring experts to provide, like I mentioned, different types of programs targeting different groups. So we have a list here in front of us of the different organizations that are currently engaged, and all of which are providing programming on the islands for different age groups. And the funding would go to them.
Great. So Itamar, I'm going to ask you to prepare for our next two sort of panelists, who I'm going to ask one question for them to briefly respond. And then at the same time, Mesa, we have so many great questions, and I'm sort of jotting them down and trying to categorize them. So we'll be able to start going into those. One of the, my final question to you, Mesa, is who should provide the funding? Who should we be relying on? Whose responsibility is it to really step up to the plate and to make these commitments to deliver education? And if you could answer that while we get our other two colleagues on the webinar as panelists, that would be brilliant.
Great. So there are three types of donors that we need to come to the table very urgently. First and foremost, this is not just a Greece crisis. This is a European crisis. In fact, this crisis has been exacerbated by the fact that Europe has locked down its borders, and therefore it's incumbent on the EU to come to the rescue here and to provide funding for the different partners in delivering education, particularly as this is a priority for EU donors. Education in the context of emergencies is a priority for most EU countries. Second, it's for the international community at large. So you have different entities in the education infrastructure that are designed to support education in developing countries and in emergency situations. And I'm really happy that we're going to have the head of Education Cannot Wait come join us in a few moments. And that fund was created precisely for emergency situations, yet for a variety of different reasons, they have not been able to support and are not able to support them in this in COVID, in the response to COVID, as well as the plan forward. And there are, I'm sure, lots of different reasons for why that is. But this is a real crisis. This is a severe humanitarian crisis. And we need to step up, and we need to make sure that the rules actually support people, not hinder progress. The third group, as I mentioned earlier, are philanthropists who are less restricted, who have a lot more flexibility, who can act much more quickly than governments do, and often that is the case. One of the largest funders of refugee education is the Hilton Foundation, where they gave a large grant to Metagrassi, which is one of the biggest NGOs working in the States. And that's the kind of leadership we need now. We need other philanthropic entities, foundations, and individuals to step in and show the way forward, and to be able to provide funding in a flexible way so that these organizations can respond quickly.
Great, thanks, Mason. I'm excited to introduce two additional individuals who are joining us right now. So following this outline and presentation of the report, both the challenges and what needs to happen, we're joined by Philippe Leclerc, who is the head of UNHCR in Greece. And we're also joined by Yasmin Sharif, who is the director of the Education Cannot Wait Fund at the United Nations. And we're so thrilled to have both of you with us. And Philippe, I have a question for you that I'd love to have your thoughts on. Mason sort of laid out this plan moving forward, and you are in Greece on the ground. What happens if we're unable to mobilize the resources that are needed? What will that reality look like?
Well, thank you, Justin, for organizing this session and supporting education on the islands of Greece. Well, just to respond immediately to your question, the little that we have been able to do for the education of children on the islands would vanish. Basically, up to 1,000 children who are managing to go almost on each island to benefit from informal education would just disappear, meaning, like we see today, to a certain extent, because of COVID, children not being able to get out of overcrowded camps, children not being able to get sufficient support to continue their education. And obviously, if we would not get the funding as of not fall, as Maisa was saying, but already as of July, because we hope that we would be able in the summer months for children who have not benefited from education to continue and to provide informal education for 1,000, but possibly up to 2,000, because this is the target we have. This would be a disaster individually for these children. It would be for their families, as well as all those who have been supporting them and bringing some hope to the individuals and to education to the people who stay too long in the camps, which continue to be overcrowded. And just to add on to your question, because I believe also that there is hope, we see that the total number of people on the islands have decreased, including in the overcrowded camps to a certain extent, 17,000 in Moria instead of 20,000. But this may only be linked to the non-arrival since April of people from Turkey because of COVID, because also of the tense relationship at one stage between Turkey and Europe. But most probably, people will arrive again on the island. So also people have been, children among them have been transferred to the mainland for some, not enough. And again, a glance of hope because of the decision of 10 member states in the European Union to provide up to 1,600 places for unaccompanied children, mostly from the islands, to join European countries. And 59 of them have left in the 2 last weeks to Luxembourg and Germany. And as you were mentioning, our partners, they have been working very hard with us in determining the best interest of these children, and with Praxis, with Metadrasi, with Arsis, to make sure that those children can leave for a better future and also better education.
Great, thanks, Philippe. I really appreciate that, and I think as you underscore, it's an issue of time running out. That without this support, things really could come to an end. Starting in June for these children, and what we've been able to provide can't be sustained. So thank you for that reflection, and also thank you for the correction on the first quiz question in the poll. I said the answer was 20,000, but you're correct. It's now down to 17,000 in the Moria camp. So as you stated, it's still well over the capacity of 2,500, but it is a change, sort of reflecting the non-arrivals plus some being moved out. So that's great to have that real-time information as well. Yasmin, I'm going to ask if you could maybe come on video and unmute yourself. There you are. Good morning. Great to see you. So you're still on mute, Yasmin. We have to turn your voice on. So Yasmin Sharif, for those of you who do not know, is the director of the Education Cannot Wait Fund at the United Nations. And it was set up just for these instances, working all around the world in these contexts when children fall through the cracks to provide education. And we've been so fortunate to partner with you, Yasmin, and the People's Postcode Lottery, the Dutch Postcode Lottery, in coming up with this initial response together with the UN agencies, where we've been able to get these programs up and running. And from your perspective, we've been out there together, we've seen these camps, we've been with Philippe and his team. Not everyone can go there. And what is it that you think we need to do to make sure the international community comes together to support the education of these children?
Thank you very much, Justin, and thanks for organizing this webinar. And it's been very interesting to listen to Marisa's presentation as well, and of course also to see Philippe again. So thank you, everyone. Just a small correction, Marisa. It's incorrect that ECW, or Education Cannot Wait, has not been able to support. We were in fact the first global fund that went out to the islands to provide support. It was raised by our chair of the high-level steering group, Gordon Brown, as an urgent priority. And following that, we conducted missions 2 years ago, and then a second mission together with Theirworld and the Postcode Lottery. And I think it resulted in Theirworld and the Postcode Lottery, who are members of Education Cannot Wait. They are strategic donor partners. I think a total of 3 million were contributed. And I think it's important that that narrative comes out, because it means that there is an example out there. There was an organization that stepped up to the plate within the limitations that we have. As a global fund, and this leads to your question, Justin, is what can the world do with the international community? What I see here, of course, we all know that the ideal solution is that Europe takes its responsibility and receive and do a burden sharing and receive these refugees in the countries in Europe, because staying on the island is not a sustainable solution. At the same time, the education that is provided and that is needed corresponds to our call for education cannot wait while you are waiting for your asylum application, which can take up over a year, and under the circumstances of 20,000 people crowding in a camp like Moria. So that's where our focus is. But the first is, of course, to open the doors in Europe. That's the number one. Two, if you cannot comply with those international obligations for whatever reason, well, you have another international obligation, and that is to provide the basic services and make sure that the humanitarian imperative, where education is the top priority, is being met on the island. And unfortunately, that's where Europe has failed as well. So the big political will for financial resources have to come from European donors. Private sector as well, as we have shown, Theirworld is not a government, nor is the Dutch postcode lottery, but they came forward and we count them as private sector or private foundation. But I think a lot of advocacy where we also speak about the legal obligations under the 51 Convention and basic human rights. We have lost complete track in Europe of what is right and wrong, not to speak about the rest of the world, and use that to reinforce the financial resources. Now, with COVID-19, I think everyone understands that if they leave these children unattended with no protection, psychosocial services that comes with education on the island, it will visit them at their homes one day or another, not only through the lack of an education, but also through COVID-19, which will fester in those camps. So I think advocacy, but I think also to look at the different advocacy messages. I think it's time to reinforce international law because Europeans are usually trying to adhere to it. They feel some obligation to still be law-abiding and abide by the emergency ruling that the Dutch countries issued, allowing for ODA money to actually be dedicated to NGOs and UN agencies working on the Greek island, which also many European donors have chosen to neglect and refuse to recognize. So, but I'm a lawyer, so that's my perspective. But there are obligations in Europe. There are obligations towards the Greek government, and there are obligations towards another European country that is receiving so many refugees. And there is above all obligations to these children and their families. And we will be more than happy to join forces, and we are already with Theirworld and UNHCR and UNICEF and others on the islands to make this advocacy strong and clear, while also continuously pursue private sector. And I want everyone to rest assured, we are pursuing private sector like we did the first time around, even for the 20 million. I'm working closely with Justin and others, and we have a dedicated UNHCR secondment in our office that is also on top of this issue. So we have done something, we'll continue to do something. It's not enough, this is clear. We need to put more pressure on those who are here to maintain international law. And the Greek islands is a very good example of that. And it's the most urgent one right now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jasmine. That's really helpful. And thanks for the clarification. That's right. You were there in the very, very beginning. Which you remember, no one else would touch the Greek islands when it came to education. You all stepped up.
With your support.
So it's been great. So thank you both to you and to Philippe. And what I'll do now is turn to some of the questions. And if you're able to stay on the line, there might be some that are relevant for the two of you. And also some are relevant for you as well, Mesa, related to the report. I'm going to try to, there's 23 left to answer, but I've tried to pool them into some themes because we do have some reoccurring questions. One question is around, and Mesa, I know you've looked a bit at this, so maybe this is for you. Best practice in the early years. So there's one question around, what's happening in the early years for these children, what's best practice? And then the other question is, we can't ignore adult training, and you're saying that there's a big proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds on the island. So could you touch on sort of both of those end caps? And Philippe or Yasmin, if you want to then add anything to that. as well, but sort of this issue of early years and then adolescence, sort of at that skills development in 18 to 24-year-old age range. So Mesa, I'll start with you, and then Philippe, Yasmin, if you have anything to add.
Sure. So one of the things that we tried to emphasize in the report is that we need a comprehensive plan. So we need an education plan that covers 0 to 30, and let me just take the youth component first, and then we'll come to the early childhood, and maybe others have to add to this. But one of the situations that we have is that many of the young people who are in Greece have not been in school for a long time, and therefore the idea of integrating them into a normal school setting is not feasible. For many of them, it's not. Also, when talking to these young people, many of them want to continue their education, but also they want the most efficient way for them to start a more sustainable life, to start earning an income. And so therefore, it's really important to be able to provide them with the skills and the training, including the language skills, of course, so that they're able to learn some skills and some certifications, gain some certifications, so that they can enter the labor market as soon as possible. Not every refugee will want to go through the traditional path of finishing K-12, then going to higher education. There are lots of opportunities within Greece to be able to work in different sectors that require skilled young people, and refugees could be employed with very specific programs that target them and that develop their skill sets. Now, coming to early childhood group, UNICEF and their partner organizations are doing a great job in this. This is, of course, the area of expertise for them, and they've built very healthy centers with the support of Theirworld and ECW to bring in young children, in particular mothers with babies, so they can provide them with some safe environments, but also some basic education and skills so that they can protect their children better. What's really notable, though, is that it's a very small number among all the children and the mothers that need support. I would also just mention, because there was a question around best practice, that this is an area that's extremely underdeveloped in the context of refugees. I speak about that from a research perspective. We don't yet have enough programs that support early childhood in the context of refugees. This is why it's so important that we started to see some large programs coming in this space, like the Sesame Street program that's working with refugee communities. Now we have some research being funded by large foundations in this space. We need much more of that to happen. I'll stop there. Perhaps others want to contribute to it.
Great. No, thanks, Mesa. And actually, Philippe and Yasmin, maybe if you could build on that, and two other questions that have come in that I think are relevant, and Philippe, you might have a better sense of this one in particular, is around health of refugees, sort of what's the status of health in the camps, and then Yasmin as well, mental health for children, refugees. I know it's an area that you care a lot about with education, cannot wait, and also children with disabilities. So those are three questions. So maybe Philippe and Yasmin, if you could sort of shed some light on public health issues currently in the camps, and then mental health and disabilities as well. That's one of the questions that's sort of a theme throughout the ones that are coming in on the chat.
Well, thank you, Justin. Of course, health is one of the basic priorities right now, and the basic challenge that we face. I say the big we, the state, the NGOs, the UN agencies, and the refugees themselves, the asylum seekers, because of COVID, which is even magnifying or making even additional challenges for health support to be provided. First, to make sure that COVID as such is also responded to. So what the Ministry of Health, AOD, Health Agency, UNHCR, NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières and Médecins du Monde are currently working to identify, and we have identified all those who may be victims of the virus to evacuate them as a priority from the camps. So right now, more than 900 of them have been evacuated, either to hotels which have been created for them to be taken to. For example, elderly with all their families, all their relatives should be transferred either to the mainland or to the islands. But as you were mentioning in your introduction, you know how tense the situation was between the government policy, the EU policy, the island communities, and the mayors, and to find hotels where people and to convince hotel owners and local communities and local mayors to open hotels is a very big challenge. So again, that's the first health priority for children, of course, for their families. We all know that children are not the first victims to the virus, but they live with their families, and it's important that all of them are protected. And the other issue that we're trying to address with the Ministry of Health, but with considerable difficulty for COVID in overcrowded camps, is to ensure that preventive measures can be taken, that hygiene is up to standard, and that the medical prevention and response is organized. And again, the basic response is that it cannot really take place in overcrowded camps. So the first response remains relocation to the mainland or evacuation outside of the camps for a large majority of people. This is the first continued answer that we have to hammer, because again, you cannot improve sufficiently hygiene conditions as well as the medical response. So this is the first one. The second is really to ensure, because we know that it will not be changed in a day, that overcrowding, even with overcrowding, these medical responses are provided. Just Sunday, a medical unit has been opened with Médecins Sans Frontières, Médecins du Monde, and others to ensure that additional support can be provided. But the lack of health nurses and medical doctors and translators remains a big challenge to an efficient response in the overcrowded camps. And again, you have to remember that the islands themselves are, not to talk only about Lesbos, but Leros, smaller ones, do not have actually for their own local communities the necessary medical support to act quickly. So far, no COVID patient or contaminated person has been made, but this may not be true because testing is not also taking place all over. So again, this is the big challenge in addition to education.
Great, thank you. Yasmin, do you want to add a bit onto that in terms of mental health disabilities as well? And you're on mute, sorry.
I'm trying to unmute so no one hears my papers moving around and my clicking on my phone. Okay, so thank you. Well, I'm not fully familiar with what the measures that are being taken in terms of facilitating for children with disabilities by the international organizations, but I can tell you from what I have seen during my 2 visits to the islands in the camps, there is absolutely no infrastructure or aids made available for refugee children sitting in these overcrowded camps who may be children with disabilities. So they're confronted with multiple protection challenges, if I were to put it that way. One is the mere fact that they are in flight as asylum seekers and refugees. 2, there are children who have disabilities who have absolutely no facilities in those overcrowded camps to sustain themselves. So that's just one side of it. And then it comes to the psychosocial services and the mental health. And we take both children with disabilities, psychosocial services, and a number of other priorities within the broader protection priority of education cannot wait. Now, every child there, and I think it would be absolutely it would be almost arrogant to say that there's any child there that is not affected, have their mental health affected. They are living under toxic stress. They have gone through enormous trauma, and the mere set up and overcrowdedness of those camps and the lack of being able to envisage their future, having no access outside the camp to anything that will take them away from that very intense situation in itself is only going to reinforce an already deteriorating that mental health. What education offers, and I've seen both what UNHCR provides and UNICEF together with NGOs and working with the government, which is quite outstanding. With the little funding, they've been able to do some amazing work in these non-formal institutions where there's an outlet, psychosocial services, and they can take different shapes and forms. I've seen study groups managed by UNHCR and UNICEF providing that psychosocial services as part of the education package in the non-formal education. The premises are usually friendly for children with disabilities, and there's transport to and from, and it provides them the sense of protective environment that allows them to do learning in many different subjects. So by not supporting the non-formal education and the recommendations by this assessment and this report, one is removing the entire holistic package of non-formal education, which also entails addressing children with disabilities, also entails addressing psychosocial needs and mental health, and the broader protection package. So basically, what Europe is telling these children is, you don't deserve any of this. Stay there and let it all wait. And we know what consequences are, not only from not learning the maths and the reading, but also from a huge gap in addressing your toxic stress, and from having been further marginalized due to being a child with disabilities. So we are creating multiple factors that will one day haunt all of us, and hopefully it will haunt our conscience more than anything else. So I think that education here and what Justin and Maisa are presenting is support to quality education, non-formal it might be, but quality education that addresses numerous protection challenges that are very real and that will impact all of us in Europe if they're not addressed now. It's right now that they are needed. So yes, I have not much more to add to that because I'm working on the ground, but from what I've seen is that the services are the highest quality. So it's more than just mobilizing resources, it's actually evidence-based.
Great, thank you very much, Jasmine. So I know there's outstanding questions. I've got three sort of groups of questions that hopefully we'll be able to wrap this up in the next 5 or 6 minutes. Philippe, there is one technical question I'm going to ask you because there's been 2 or 3 people that have asked about new legal requirements from the Greek government for NGOs to operate, and if that will have an impact on education. And so I'm going to ask you to respond to that question because you're the closest to the situation and might be able to provide some insight. Mesa, then I'd like to go to you. There's one question around sort of is the big purpose here to reallocate the refugees or move them on to Greece? If you could just touch on that. And then there's some questions around the list of NGOs that are on the one slide that we had earlier is sort of short, and some people have said, there are so many organizations providing work here. So if you could just give some insight into how the organizations there were selected and sort of how money again would be distributed, et cetera. That's one of the questions. And then anything else that you'd want to add. And then the final question, which I'll come back to, is many of you are saying, what can I do? What should we do? What can we be doing? And so I think that's how we'll end up today. And then for any questions we did not get to, we will come back to you over email as well. So this is just the beginning of the conversation, not the end. So Philippe, on that technical question around these legal requirements, could you shed some light on that for us, please?
Yeah, well, Justin, you're right, and I think the NGOs and the associations who are present today are right to put that at the debate, because tomorrow in the Greek Parliament there will indeed be a draft legislation presented by the government which will discuss the revision of the Asylum Act of November 2019, which poses quite a lot of challenges in terms of international refugee law, European law. But one of the other issues is further restrictions and registration for NGOs to operate in the refugee-related situation. We have described how much NGOs are important both on the islands and on the mainland. What is important is that these legal requirements are not too strict and that they are not applied also in a strict manner. So we are advocating for these legal requirements to be as light as possible. Of course, not denying the right for the state to register NGOs, which is the possibility, but also in terms of public discourse, I think it's both the legal issues that have to be addressed, but also ensuring that the government and public personalities, be it in parliament or elsewhere, on the islands and on the mainland, do not demonize some NGOs, as sometimes is the case, and on the contrary, thank and make sure that their contribution is really made known to the general public in Greece. Otherwise, we may face, as we have seen recently, some direct attacks also by some, in exceptional situations, but more and more, towards NGOs who are assisting refugees and asylum seekers in the islands in particular. So this is a very important issue to continue to address, both legally and in the public discourse.
Excellent, thank you, Philippe. Mesa, sort of some of the questions around the sort of relocation to the mainland, but then some of the questions around the different NGOs, the ability of the smaller NGOs to be able to reach some areas where some of the larger organizations cannot, how these groups are selected and vetted, how they work with the government. That's sort of one of the reoccurring themes. Sort of, what are they doing, and where's the money coming from, and who does it go to?
Right.
And any wrap-up points as well.
Yes, for those who have asked the question whether the ultimate goal is first and foremost to move the children off the island and onto the mainland, absolutely. This is what everyone wants. The government, UN agencies, everyone wants to move the children off the islands onto the mainland. First and foremost, because it is the humanitarian conditions on the islands are horrific, and they should not have to endure living there for one more day. But second, because access to support services, including education, would be much better on the mainland. So their ability to integrate them into public education on the mainland would be much better. And so the plan of moving them is very much tied to access to public education. Now, we're calling for support in this report for non-formal education because we know that many children have had to stay for extended periods of time on the island. And we know that some of them will continue to be there for some time, and others will also arrive, possibly, after the current sort of stop due to the pandemic. So it is essential for us to continue to support non-formal education because that is the first point of entry for many refugee children. And it is a way to essentially start supporting them, helping them heal, to provide them with the psychosocial support, to build the skill sets that they need so that they can eventually integrate into the public education system. The second point was around NGOs, how they're identified and how they get funding. Now, that's perhaps a question better asked of local authorities and organizations that are working there. What we tried to do in the report, which is often missing from reports like this, and as part of our responsibility to showcase what's happening there, is to present some examples of organizations that we visited, we talked to, that partners to the UN agencies that have significant presence. This is by no means a comprehensive list. So if you don't see your name listed as an organization, this does not have anything to do with us not recognizing you. By all means, this is a fluid process, and there is opportunity to engage much more widely. Hopefully, if funding is secured, many more organizations will be able to participate in scaling up the effort, because that's ultimately the goal that we're after. Was there a third part, or did I cover it?
I think that's any other concluding thoughts you have, and then I'll turn to what people can do, and we'll wrap it up because we've now hit the time mark.
Sure. My concluding comment would be to say that this is very much a solvable problem. This is not insurmountable. The amount that's required is actually not hugely significant in the grand scheme of humanitarian assistance. The organizations are there, the parties are there, the UN agencies, the NGOs are there. They are able to deliver. We need support urgently. We cannot waste any more time, but we also need to recognize that this is a larger challenge. We need to support the Greek government, and we need the EU and the international community to step up.
Right. Well, the question that came out most in the Q&A was, what can I do? What can an individual do? If I'm a college student, can I be involved in the solution? How do we get the media more involved in addressing this issue and highlighting it? And so that's what I'll conclude with. I'll wrap up by thanking all of you for showing up today and sort of taking the first step to learn more about the report, about the situation, about the organizations out there doing the work on the ground. And at one point, I think we had about 100 people on the call, which is fantastic. What can you do? The first thing is spread the word. Many of you are learning about this for the first time. Others are working on this day on and day out. We need to make sure that more and more people realize that this is an issue. So at the end of this, we're going to send you an email. We're going to send you some sample posts, a video that you can put online to share with your friends, your colleagues on social media, highlighting the issue. We first need to spread the word and educate people about the crisis that these young children face. The second thing is to make your voice heard. So at Theirworld.org, we're running a petition, and we're asking people to sign up to it. That's going to these leaders at the European Union, the European donors, the other big international organizations that can play a role, saying that we want this plan fully funded. So not just spread the word, but take action and lend in your voice. We need to be heard. You can go to theirworld.org, and we'll also send the link to our action center on our email, and take action. That's how we unlock big change. All of us can do something together, but we really need to pull those big levers that can create this flow of resources so that all of the organizations working on the islands can deliver, can work together with the government, and we can get a solution to this crisis. And then some of you ask about contributing financial resources. And yes, of course, that's welcome. And as Yasmin pointed out, it's not just about public dollars and public resources, even though we think there's a big role for the European donors to play. It's about private sector and philanthropists also getting involved. And so you can visit us at theirworld.org. You can send us an email. You can work with us or any of the partners. You can go straight to the field and straight to the many organizations that are working on this solution. But there's a role for you to play in contributing as well. So no amount of money is too small, and no amount is too large as we're trying to deal with this. And so you can do it from an individual to many of the great organizations where we can help you direct that funding with ourselves and with Education Cannot Wait. And we also need to unlock the big dollars from the European donors and from the others around the world. And so spreading the word, adding your voice, contributing where you can, that's really what we need, because at the moment, this crisis with COVID-19 in one way highlights so many people that typically aren't noticed during the day, the transportation workers, the supermarket clerks, but at the same time, it pushes so many more people who were voiceless to begin with further to the margins. And today we're talking about a group of thousands of young refugee children who all they want is a chance at a better future. They want the opportunity to learn. They want to participate in society. And we need your help in spreading the word and to mobilizing the resources so that we can make that happen. And we're not going to stop at Theirworld until we reach every single one of those children. We know that all of our partners out there from the UN agencies and the global funds are here to work with us and with all of you to make that happen. So for those of you working day in and day out, thank you for what you're doing. And we are here to support you and to amplify your work globally so we can get more and more people really supporting that and helping children around the world realize their potential and unleash opportunity for themselves and their communities. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to Mesa for a great report, to Philippe, to Yasmin for coming on board with those insights from your perspectives. It's been a really great way to start my day. I can see Mesa, it's getting dark outside. It's a great way to end your evening. And Philippe, it's sort of sometime in the afternoon. So you still have a few more hours to spend on the education crisis in Athens, I'm sure. Thanks everybody for joining. Again, we'll send you an email with a recap. If we didn't answer your question, we will do our best to come back to it offline. So thanks so much, and we look forward to
everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.